Today's episode will be with Jez Hughes. We'll be talking about his book, The Wisdom of Mental Illness, which I found fascinating. It's a really well written book, great read. And in the episode today, Jez is talking about his journey. And there's lots and lots of interesting parallels with the sort of creative thinking and what I would term as, the sort of musical creativity as well. So without further ado. Okay, so today's episode, I'm talking to Jez Hughes. Jez, welcome.
Hi.
How are you? You all right? Thanks for being on.
Yeah, good. Pleasure.
Traditional first question. What do you do?
What do I do? I bang a drum. Bang a drum, and I bang a drum and I bang on quite a lot. And then I write books as well.
Cool.
I suppose you want a serious answer, but
No, that's a good answer.
I work as a in general, yeah. I work as a kind of what in modern day parlance is really called a shamanic practitioner, shamanic teacher. So for 15 years, I practiced full time doing healings one on one, and out of that came after a lot of training, and then I started practicing, and out of that one on one, and also connecting to the land, which I'm very passionate about in the woods, and through that learning, I created and a lot of learning that I'd done. I'd created a training program myself, a training program to shape people into the elements and into connection with the land and their ancestors, and bring in. I mean, the intention really is to bring a shamanic practice back to Britain, really, an animistic shamanistic practice back to Britain. Obviously, our lineages were broken, and shamanism really comes from more hunter gatherer, maybe small scale farming societies. So it's something bringing that kind of ancient way of viewing the world and cosmology, and making it relevant, because it transforms and changes through time, and it's going to be different now in a modern kind of world, so making it relevant for the modern world, but also holding on to the integrity. I work a lot with indigenous people, so holding on to the integrity of their teachings, and but not just borrowing their teachings, because I think that each land has its own spirit to it, and the traditions will also be buried in the land, so listening to that, and being inspired, and learning a lot from indigenous cultures, and yeah, transposing it, acting like a bridge, I suppose, between ancient cultures and a modern one, and bringing something that has shamanic roots to it, but again, like I say, with this, that's relevant for now.
Mm. So, how did you get interested in stuff like that? Because obviously, for all people who do anything that's a little bit unusual, it doesn't just happen, does it? Or there's a bit of a lead in time, lots of experiences.
No,
So
yeah,
how did you get interested?
I was going to be a professional footballer, as I've written about and talked about a lot of the times, but I got injured, and at the same time, my mental health went through quite a crises for about 15 years, from the age of sort of 15, but then more likely from the more intensely rather from sort of late teens to early 30s, and that was a time when mental health wasn't really talked about at all. Even depression wasn't even mentioned, particularly in kind of growing up in a very working class, normal environment. So I went on a journey, really. I went on a journey to heal myself. I had an experience which I've talked a lot about many times when I was 14, which was a spontaneous connection, mystical experience, really, connection to oneness, a spiritual experience after a convulsive fit. Um, at 14, and that was really the kind of catalyst for this opening up, I suppose, of awareness, but not having any context for it, and being blown open, really, if I'm honest, and blown open, and through that experience a lot of instability and painful experiences of being far too open, like being a kind of walking down the street, hallucinating, etc., etc. So having these kind of psychotic breaks with reality, and the anxiety that precipitated a lot of and these convulsive fits that were on and off again for about 15 years. So going really on a journey to heal myself and explore, but also at the same time very interested always in different states of consciousness, I suppose, and have an awareness that there is more to reality than what we're kind of prescribed or given in our culture. So, and discovering in eventually in Australia, really, on this kind of crazy journey, really, to try and heal myself, which finding some things that helped, getting interested in Eastern traditions, and then finding a lot of things that didn't help and made things a lot worse, and then kind of really resonating with the land in Australia, and then the finding discovering intellectually a lot about the Aboriginal culture, and feeling a sense of coming home with that, and a sense of something that resonated really deep in my body and my heart. And then discovering this concept of the shamanic sickness, which I wrote a lot about in
Mm.
my latest book, which provided meaning and context for what I was going through, and that was huge um, a huge part of healing for me, to be honest, to realize I wasn't just crazy
Mm.
and not able to function in the world. I could function for a little bit, and then I would have these kind of breakdowns, and I was always strong-willed and would keep going, which is it was good in one respect and not so good in others. So really, but shamanism provided this context for me. I was seeking, I didn't realize I was seeking, but I think I was seeking in this deep level for some kind of meaning, context. And this idea of the shamanic sickness took a great burden off. It didn't completely heal me. I had to then practice, and I knew, because I'm quite a literal person, I knew I couldn't just read about this, or discover it intellectually. I really had to find a way in, if you like. And
Mm.
luckily, I met some teachers, and then learned about this stuff, and then went on a journey of 20 over 20 years, really, with various teachers, and then the last 9 years working with very closely with an indigenous tribe from Mexico called the Radica, or Huichol in Spanish,
Mm.
and developing that friendship. And so healing myself, trying to find something more. I think the kind of normal, classic ways in, I suppose. I mean, it'd be lovely. I always say this. It would be lovely if people got onto a spiritual path through a kind of nice, smooth, easy process, or
Mm.
something they're interested in. But usually, there's some kind of catalytic event in their life, and it usually comes out of difficulty and struggle and trauma, to be honest. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I think as human beings, we would just get on with life. We would do sensible things like watch the football and go down the pub.
Yes. But I mean, it's not even easy for the shamanic people, is it? Traditional shamanic cultures. It's not an easy ride for
In
them either.
Yeah,
You know.
no, I mean they definitely. A lot of indigenous people think. Westerners are quite crazy to want to be
Yes,
shamanic practitioners,
yes,
whatever you want to call it, shamans,
yes.
because in their culture it is seen as quite a burden because you have a lot of you're taking on the responsibility for the community and the community sickness, really, not just individual human sickness, but also the in relationship to the land and and the loyalty is very split because you're half the loyalty is to the land, to the spirits, nature being the invisible face of spirit. So the and when I say spirit, it's really the invisible forces that kind of create life and keep it held together.
Mm.
They're seen as being the kind of the owners, if you like, or the bosses, and so there's a loyalty to them, but there's also the loyalty to the human and the community, and keeping that in balance between the needs of the spirits and the needs of the humans. So it is seen as quite a lot of, and working with indigenous people, you see literally how hard they do work. I mean, this isn't. I think in modern times or in the West, we have this idea of kind of mysticism being this beautiful experience of oneness and transcendental experiences, which is great. That's a part of it, but that's never in shamanic cultures. That's never the
Yes,
aim. The aim is to be of service to your community. You have those experiences as kind of side effects, if you like, and even then they're not so in when you work with the indigenous tribes, they're not so important. That they don't care that much if you've had those experiences. They care if you're there to prepare food for people or to share your food or to if someone is in trouble to help them out. So it's much more, that's what they're interested in because it's much more collectivist and about the community and about the group.
yes,
So yeah, for sure, and that initiation, therefore, not all cultures have this concept of the shamanic sickness, and the radical, like I say, who I work with, they don't necessarily have that concept. But then they're a very old culture. Their
mm,
traditions are unbroken. They go back. No one knows how long, but probably thousands of years, and they practice very much something called family shamanism, which is
mm,
that's the kind of official anthropological term, which means there'll be one or two people in the family that will be, in their culture they're called marakamis, so
yeah,
it's not seen as something so special.
no,
And also their whole culture is engaged in the rituals, the offerings, the prayers, and the eating of the sacrament, which is hickory or peyote in Spanish. So their whole culture, the Ramat is spends a lot of the year engaged in ceremonies and offerings. So it's not just the responsibility of the Marakamis, although they will lead.
yes. I, I thought you just, I think you've just frozen a little bit there. Um,
Okay.
you said something, you used the term transcendental. Um, I,
Yeah.
um, because I think actually there's something in this about Western viewpoint and how we've arrived at where we are now, and how this sort of transcendental aspect has sort of filtered its way through, even though people don't sort of think, well, you know, how can we put this? The norm is not to sort of consider that very much, but it's sort of in everything. It's this idea that you can qualify to become better than somebody else. In other words, you can be higher up the ladder or whatever. And I mean, it seems to be something that we do in the West, which I don't know. Maybe you can, you know, you've probably already answered this by saying about the Huichol people, that it's not really, you know, it's not that special. It's not like you're, that's not the word I'm saying, but you haven't sort of gone up the ladder to the other people. You know what I mean? It's not like you're in some sort of revered, almost hero place, because it's that, to me, that transcendental type thinking about, even, you know, transcendentalism in spiritual thinking, that you're elevated and look at these other people, they're down in the gutter type of idea.
Yeah.
There is something strange that permeates, or this is what I see, in lots of things that we do in the West. Whereas, you have an expert at something. It's just, I can see it in that as well.
Yeah.
And and I've had some experience with Amazonian ceremonies. And those people, although, we would think of them as being very special, it's not pompous. There's a lot of, obviously, ritual, which we can look at as being rather unusual and a display, but they seem to be incredibly grounded people. Well, that's what I always experience when I've seen people like that. It's like they didn't consider themselves to be elevated in any way. Like you're saying, they were doing a job, if you see what I mean. Anyway, that's just a thought, because I think this is something that sort of sits at the root of a lot of things that we have in the West that we find really difficult to deal with. That, if, like, in your experience, because I wanted to come back to your experience that you said when you were 14 and how you then went on a journey, because a lot of people wouldn't have done what you did. They would have just taken professional advice and just try to get on and live their life, but you actually actively went to find your own healing. So I was interested in how and why you did that. What happened with that experience in the beginning when you were 14? Did you realize at the time there was something that it shattered your reality? Was that the experience that you had?
That's a really good question. Why did I do that? I think because, I mean, I don't want to be glib, but I'm stubborn. I don't like being told what to do, and that
Join
is
the
a
club.
kind of,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that kind of stubbornness and needing to find out for myself. I think it has its advantages. It also has its disadvantages, because I think my journey lasted a long time because of that stubbornness, and I could have done with actually asking for help a lot more. Really, I always had a lot of shame, if I'm honest, and there was something in the experience. It did shatter my. I mean, it's you come home from school, you go to bed, and then one minute, and then the next minute you're convulsing on the bed,
mm,
and then the next minute after that, or rather after a bit of time, I'm kind of everything just goes still, and there's this kind of feeling of absolute oneness and aliveness with everything. Um, but the next day I was embarrassed, if I'm honest about
mm,
it. I was embarrassed that the doctors had been called out. My parents didn't want to talk. They came from a kind of very traditional kind of English, although they're Irish by descent. Don't talk about too much strange stuff, and really, and especially anything emotional. So it was kind of swept under the carpet. But what made me, because I think, and then it would happen kind of on a semi-regular basis, where I would, not to that extent, but things would, I would go into what I'd recognize now as a trance state. I was
yes,
quite easily pushed into these trance states, and they would be both terrifying, because when you have this reality slip away and you're in this deeper state, I suppose, and but also there'd be something very comforting about them, and something quite beautiful, and I I knew that there must be some kind of meaning behind that.
yeah,
I didn't, but also, I mean, I can look at it as the bigger picture now, and say, well, that was my journey for 15 years, but it wasn't my sole driving purpose, because for other times I would have periods of, say, 6 months, a year, sometimes 2 years, where the symptoms would recede, and I could get on with life, and that was what I was interested in. getting on with life and living a kind of more normal life. So I've always had this kind of ambivalence, really, in some respects, that what what is these exalted states and these states, different states of consciousness, and the searching can also have come from with a lot of pain and isolation and loneliness, and then there's always been a part of me that just really wanted to be that professional footballer or be something even more normal than that. So I think that ambivalence is really important on any spiritual path. I think when you become too um, intense with it and too that is all your life, and I've done this with periods of my life, whereas shamanism is everything. I think you become much too rigid, and you become um, you start preaching too much to everyone, and just become a bit of a nightmare. So I think that ambivalence is quite a good kind of grounding thing. And I think, just to pick up on what you were saying about the um, this idea that shamans are special, I think that's also a civilization problem. It's not just West. I think East has that sometimes with their traditions of the guru and stuff like
Oh
this.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That it's actual civilization, whereas
yeah,
the Wura are highly, because they're very small scale farming, and they live in small extended family units basically. Um, they can be, and they are much more egalitarian,
yeah,
and I think there's that kind of special number. I think it's 150, over 150 people in a society. You have to have more hierarchy, you have to have
yeah,
more rules and structures, and the Wura are still in that kind of sweet number. They're part of a much bigger community, but
yeah,
they they're kind of different ceremonial centers are basically extended family units,
yeah,
and so they're able to be much more egalitarian and less hierarchical. I think we've taken it in the West now to this kind of pinnacle of hierarchy, and we bring that, and you're right, we bring that into our spirituality, and we project all of this hierarchy onto the spirituality, as if, and this kind of one person or one guru or whatever's sitting at the height of that. And and it is interesting working with the Wira, because they're much more, each Marakami will have a different interpretation, and also they don't actually teach, even if the your dad or your mum or your grandfather is a Marakami, they won't teach you anything. They will say, be part of the ceremony, go to the library, which is the Wirakuta, where the hickory grows, and listen to the fire and listen to the hickory, and the powers of nature, the spirits will teach you. So there is much more, which gives a real flexibility as well. I think of not one dogmatic way is the truth, because and I think and that's why indigenous people struggle to organize, and they struggle, especially when colonial forces coming in, because they don't organize in the same way under these belief systems. They have so many different ideas of reality, and each one is but within the framework of a much bigger tradition, and
mm.
that is kept to, and the framework of the tradition is the most important thing. So, and again, the individual is not that really important.
No, 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 because I think what happens, like coming back to the sort of West thing, where we have this sort of idea of a hierarchy, then you start getting what is considered as being normal. And then if you're not in that little sweet spot, then there's something wrong. you know.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
when you have
yeah.
when you have small groups of people that are dependent upon one another, you get a different sort of flow of things. Okay, it's not to say people can't be difficult and all the rest of it, because that's the way. But it's like
Of
one of the
course.
examples I often give, like over here, if you get something like an intentional community, right, in the West, in this country, um, it's a nightmare. They never work because everybody's got their own idea of utopia. And And it's because
Exactly.
it's not, they're not thrown together in any shape or form, because it's like, well, I really don't like that person, but I'm really dependent upon him for my survival. This is, and he is dependent upon me as well. That's a different way. And that's what communities would have been like if you went back in time far enough. If it's a small
Absolutely.
community, then you are dependent on one another. So that's the way it is. But I just think it's quite interesting. Whatever we
Exactly.
do, wherever we're trying to go back to an idea, we're still carrying all this stuff, which is our ideas of how things should be, instead of it being like you're saying. They wouldn't necessarily have the same ideas about how, well, for the way that things work. Basically, they may, one person, one, as I said, Murakami may have one way that they will tell the story about how they work and how the world is to them, and somebody else could have a completely, well, I won't say completely different, but they'll have another story. And of course, we have to have the official line, you see what I mean, don't we, in this country? We've got to do this because this is what the experts have told us, or whatever it is. So going back to this, you're saying about,
I think,
I'm interested in your journey when you started to hit that point where you were going, this is, it's not, this is unfortunate. I was going to say, this is going to help me. That's a bit of a bad way of putting it. But when did you get to the point where you started to see a path in this? Because was there something in particular that made you go? Because you mentioned the Aboriginal people of Australia, but was there something before that you started getting
yeah, I mean,
interested?
that was, I think that was the introduction to a kind of animistic view of reality.
Right.
Um, and in from, again, like I say, from a more intellectual position, which I think that is the problem, as you mentioned there, that if there's any intentional community or whatever, it is very much from the top down.
Yeah.
We come from this intellectual position of idealism or
Yeah.
ideology or whatever you want to call it, and rather than, shamanism is always about survival. It's always about survival. And it's very pragmatic and practical. Survival of the tribe. And so for me personally, it's I don't think there was one kind of eureka moment. There was several along the way. It's and as most people would know who know me will attest to, I'm not that great at planning. So in
Okay.
terms of forward planning, uh, it's I didn't have an idea. Oh, this I'm going to get into shamanism, and the idea of actually that I would end up being doing healings for people was nothing. It was never kind of really in the script.
Yeah.
I didn't really set out for that. That was a kind of response to the fact that I'd received so much healing, and it felt like a, a kind of responsibility to give back. So in terms of there was many moments. It's the only way I can really sum it up is this feeling, and this is what did hit me in the outback of Australia and when I was traveling, is this feeling of the connection to the land speaking, and and I wrote about, I think in my first book, being in the desert in the Wurakuta, not with the Radhika, with because I wasn't connected to them then, but this sense, because I was very interested in environmental ideas, and I'd worked for Friends of the Earth for a while, as a volunteer, and then fundraising, and also, and I was so this thing that the land is constantly speaking and has the power to heal itself, and that if only we kind of listen enough. So even though I was on my own journey, very much of healing, there was always at the same time this I suppose even from a young age, I used to look at when they would be digging up the roads, and I would think there's so much effort. Why all this effort? And I think what I was really feeling beneath all of that was, why are we constantly building? Why are we constantly taking from the earth? Although I wouldn't have ever kind of put that in any kind of
Yep.
conceptual idea at that time. It was more a sense of what's the point? What's the point of building all these bigger roads or these cities, and where's it all going to? And so that was really in the outback of Australia, particularly this sense of the land and the power of that, and it's the same in the desert. And interestingly enough, the more I've worked with the Radhika, they have a very similar, in many ways, tradition to the Aboriginals in terms of this concept of the ancestors dreaming and
Yep.
and then coming to rest in the land, which are the sacred sites that they constantly visit through their pilgrimages to give offer, and they're constantly moving across the landscape, and with that they're leading energy lines, if you like. And that's what the I think that's the power we have as human beings, to be creative dreamers, that if we listen to the land, that through our intention we can bring these energy lines and give power to them through our intention, through our collective fasting, through our prayers and our ceremonies, and literally through walking across the land. So, and that nomadic spirit was definitely something that has always resided deep into my soul. I think that so so they all kind of came together, if you like. The concept that I could heal myself or could be healed by this path, and at the same time that if I had which the trance states were teaching me without me realizing, I would, and I only have to, it's still, I only have to get in a car or travel across land, and I can immediately go into this very deep trance state, and I can feel the land singing or speaking to me. So that was presumably teaching me and guiding me. It's just over the years I've become much more aware of it, and I'm able to put concepts around it, and speak about it and communicate around it. So this idea that the land, I could be part of this land's healing as well, not, and at the same time it would feed, because I always say about this stuff, we don't, the Wirra will spend 6 months of the year going all across Mexico. They're very poor people, so they spend all their money. They live a subsistence-based life, but they spend all their money, spare resources, on these pilgrimages and on these offerings. It costs a lot of money, and the development agency's nightmares, because the development agency would go in and say, save that money, build some infrastructure, but they would always, whatever they gain, they will spend on their pilgrimages, on their on feeding the land, feeding the gods and goddesses. So, but we don't know, if they travel 500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers across the land in order to feed the gods, so the rain will come back in their community, which is very dry. Who knows if that is just a quaint superstition, or some kind of magical thinking, or it's complete craziness. But what you can observe, I mean, I feel like I know from seeing beyond the kind of manifest reality, but I can't persuade anyone of that. But what I can observe very literally and in a real way is how light they are as people, and how they live very long lives, and how, to be honest, it's spending that amount of energy and gratitude and offerings and fiesta and celebrations. It brings a spirit that is extraordinary, and that they don't tend to have. They have their own issues, of course they do, in the communities. Any human community does, but not necessarily the heaviness. Certainly not the depression or the kind of things that we experience a lot of in modern civilization. they have a, like I say, very light spirit. They're easy to laugh. They love to laugh. They love
Yes.
laugh very quickly and easily, and
Yes.
even though they live very tough lives. So I think that it's the proof is in the culture that is created, and if you create a culture that is based on prayer, offerings, sacrifice, beyond the individual, and look into the community, but also look into nature and the wider community, and keeping that balance and making sure you're feeding and feeding more than you're taking from life and from the earth. There is a natural balance that is created through that. So this, I suppose, this drove me, even though I'm only kind of thinking about it now. I wouldn't have put it in this concept right then, but there was a feeling, definitely a feeling that A, there must be more to life than this, and B, that we can be part of have a more harmonious relationship with the earth, and be part of much more, and it's a win-win situation rather than the kind of the continuous taking and building, and then the suffering of individuals within that culture who don't fit in.
Yes. I totally agree with you. I think you're saying about, that they walk enormous distances on their pilgrimages, right? But of
Yes,
course,
they used to. I mean, nowadays they travel by car.
um, but of course, if you go back far enough, then humans would have walked massive distances anyway, because as hunter-gatherer people, you did, you must have done. You didn't stay in one place until people started to, you know, create some sort of agricultural base. But you could see it in things like just in
Yeah.
pilgrimages. In there's a bit of a resurgence of pilgrimages in this country, but there is something about walking the land, as you say, with a reason that's not to do with yourself primarily. Um, it's not an egotistical journey. Um, and obviously, a lot of those pilgrimages that would have been undertaken, say in the Middle Ages, would have been also for some form of healing or some sort of prayer or whatever. And I've been doing some little pilgrimage walks around this, like the old way and stuff like that. And there is something in just walking the land and just being, in your own thoughts or in the thoughts of whatever's around you, that puts you in another space. And there's, as you said, I don't think there's any rational way of looking at stuff. But I think, because you said about, you look at those people and they live, they're subsistence farmers. They're giving away whatever they've basically got, which seems logically to be insane to do that. But they live long lives, and you often see in nature the unexpected consequence of an action, don't you? It's a natural event, a bee pollinating a flower. It's not intending to pollinate a flower, it just wants something to eat or whatever it is. But there's always that. And of course, we as humans consistently trip ourselves up with this unintended consequence. We do something we think is a good idea, and then suddenly there's a payment to be made that we haven't thought of. Instead of us making the payment first, which is like this more of a traditional way of doing stuff, paying up front so that you can, request that you won't be forgotten when the rains come and all that sort of stuff. You're not demanding anything,
Yeah.
It's almost 180 degrees away from where we are in our own thinking now.
Yeah.
And yet that seems to be the way of thinking that maybe we've had for most of our existence, of paying up front, making sure that where you were in the scheme of things was okay. You know, and I think there's a lot in this to do with like creative thinking, that ability to, because you can't be creative without paying your dues first. You can't suddenly become a great artist or a great musician without putting hours of working. Before anything comes out of it is of any consequence.
Yeah,
But we don't do that, do we? You want something now.
exactly.
And again, going back to the spirituality
Yeah.
thing, I remember somebody, I think it was actually Stuart Wilde, said this about, you know, but it was more or less at the time it was pointed at the Americans, because the Americans were the first on the thing for being able to buy enlightenment type of idea. You know, you could go on the course and spend the money. But if that seems to be again 180 degrees away from where we've probably always thought in a different way. You know, it's interesting. They must be very puzzled though, those the Huichol people, about attitudes of Western people. I suppose they're fully aware of what we do, or are they?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, I can't really speak for them, but I think they on some level, in my experience, they see their role as is just teaching us to remember.
Yeah,
It's not kind of remember the, like you say, the way we've existed for tens of thousands of years, and
yeah,
it's really kind of a blip almost of that we've kind of become disconnected. I think human beings always have that potential because we have the trickster mind,
yeah,
and that's our biggest gift, but it's also our most dangerous aspect. And that trickster in us, the part of us that says, oh, let's oh, I've got this great idea, let's follow that up.
yeah.
um that's that's the part that's out of control.
Yes,
Let's build a city there. Let's build. Oh, that's really irrational. Like we keep tripping us because a trickster will always trip themselves up and then find a way out of that, and then trip themselves up again through finding that way out, and then have to find another way out. And
yes,
that's that creative, incredible creative intelligence that we have gifted, and which probably separates us a little bit from nature. um, but that's the one that needs to be kept in check, if you like.
yes,
And that's what's gone out, that's gone crazy
yes,
in our society. And you see it in like you say, in spirituality, you see it as well. The next best idea,
yeah,
I call it the turmeric effect. Turmeric, I don't know if you remember.
yeah. That's a good one.
When turmeric was the kind of the it would have healed everything, and then for months, or about 6 months, everyone is
Yeah,
drinking turmeric mixed with whatever,
yeah, yeah.
and
Turmeric
this is the
latte. Yeah, I know.
panacea. Yeah, the panacea that's going to solve the
Yeah,
human
I know.
dilemmas of every, and then it will be onto something else, and then it will be onto something
Yeah,
else, and then it be onto something else, and that is the trickster mind.
yeah,
And that's where ancient cultures, and that's why I think we have to learn and be humble enough to learn that is is that they do have something to teach us, and that's
mm,
that, like I said, each Murakami will receive their different guidance, but it's within the context and the container, if you like, of a very strong tradition,
yeah,
and that has been going on, like I say, thousands of years. So they, whatever, then they can't ever go too far outside of that tradition, because that's what's holding it on
yeah,
the bigger level.
yeah,
Whereas we have the opposite. There's no tradition, or no remembered tradition, that's been unbroken. There is traditions, of course there is, and they're still in the land, buried there. But and so this leads to this trickster creative intelligence getting out of control. And most indigenous tribes will honor the trickster through individuals that will have to bring forth that energy, but again, it's in a contained way, it's in a
yeah,
ritualized way. And that's the power of ritual, it contains things.
yeah,
So that trickster energy, which is really important, it's human beings, it's there to, it's it's that a part of our ability to evolve. It's a part of our creative intelligence. It's a part of our magic and genius, if you like, as a
Yes.
species. But it needs containing within a ritual
We've always
enclosure.
known that, haven't we? Because all the
Otherwise, and
cult, sorry, I was going to say all cultures have got the trickster um, element in their
exactly,
myths,
yeah,
which,
yeah,
I mean, obviously in the Western Christian traditions, obviously the Garden of Eden story, and of course that is always,
yeah,
that I've sort of reflected on how amazing that story actually is, because it's one of those sort of, the Genesis story, we just sort of look at and go, oh, sort of crazy. But again, it's that sort of thing about you have the knowledge, and then as soon as you act on that knowledge, there's a consequence of that knowledge, you know.
exactly,
Um,
yeah,
and
yeah,
we tend not to think like that. We think we've got the knowledge and there's no consequence. And also the
yeah,
fact that a lot of the trickster gods are also the ones, they bring you the writing, they bring you all these amazing things, and they bring you fire, they bring you this, and they're often
right, yeah, exactly,
deeply interested in humanity as well, but they also lie, and
yeah,
they all,
yeah,
they can do some terrible things. If you think about some of the Greek classical stories of Hermes or whatever, he'll murder somebody if it seems to be the thing to do, you know. So you look at
yeah.
that and you think, well, we're already being told all the
But there's
time.
no empathy. That's Yeah. And there's no empathy with the trickster. That's the gift, if you like. There's no, and because of that lack of empathy and also lack of that ability to not interconnect with, it can change things and evolve things because
Yeah,
it breaks free of the mold.
yeah,
But if we're constantly feeding that trickster spirit, then we're constantly, and I see that in our society, we have revolution after counter revolution
yeah,
after revolution after counter revolution, all, and we're constantly creating the kind of disastrous side of the trickster, where there is literally no stability. There's
yeah,
no tradition, there's no culture. So we're constant, and that puts human beings in incredibly anxious states because there's no grounding, there's no foundations. The trickster's constantly being fed, so it's constantly, so yeah, that it helps us evolve, but at the same time it needs to be contained within a tradition where it's not gonna the trickster's not gonna be that destructive, if you
yeah,
like, the destructive side, which is
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's very good. So your books then, um when did you you got two books out? When did you write the first one? Because how many years ago?
it was 2015 it came out, I think. I mean, I used to, because I only really get time in the winter to write, so I spent about 3 years writing sort of 30,000 words, and then having 6 months off, then going back to it and thinking no, no,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
and getting rid of that,
yeah. I know the feeling.
and also, yeah, and also I swore I'd never write a shamanic book. But I've got, and that's the trickster in me. I got this idea. If I say I'm never going to do anything, there's
Yeah,
kind of a guarantee I'm going to
yeah,
do it at some.
yeah,
So, A, I didn't think I had anything to say, and then 100,000 words later, I realised I had quite a lot to say. And B, I just thought, no, because I've always wanted to be a writer. I've written poetry, fiction, plays. I thought, no, I want to write the great novel of the 21st
yeah, yeah,
century. I don't want to write a shamanic book. And then it was write what you know. So I think and then a good friend of mine who was an author said, no, just uh, get it out. He had a look at it for me and he said, no, this is good, get it out. And so I did. And I wrote the next sort of 60,000 words in about 2 months. And that's why the second book, The Wisdom of Mental Illness, I wrote in I started it in the lockdown and then finished it and then got busy and then finished again in about the majority in about 2 months. I tend to write quite,
yeah,
and not really, I mean, that with that book, I was, I was going to bed about 1:30 in the morning, and then waking up at 4 with more ideas. And then I was writing about psychosis, and I was hallucinating through lack of sleep.
Yeah,
And
it
so I
sounds good.
thought, well,
Sounds the
I'm
right mind state.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. At least I'm kind of, yeah, exploring it. But um so that's how I write. I kind of very spend years procrastinating like a lot of creative people, and then when it comes in it just bursts out.
Yeah. No, it's interesting this because obviously I talk to a lot of people. I mean, people write books, and, lots of creatives, and that sort of thing about I really need to do that. And the ones that seem to really just not to have a problem with any of that is the like you say, they don't plan. It just sort of happens. They think, oh, I'll sit down, I'll do this, and then it develops into this, and then somebody, like you said, somebody sits there and thinks, oh, looks, reads what you're doing, and says, oh, that's really good, and that gives you the next impetus. It's not like you sat down and thought, right, okay, so I've got 6 months, and I'm going to spend so many hours a day, or whatever. Um, but I think those creative processes are great for a lot of creative people. That sort of thing, that it's not it's not linear. It's very sort of lateral. You can come at things. But I really did enjoy. I did say that to you. I really enjoyed reading the book. I found it really well written, and I've always been interested in stuff like this, and I thought you put it across really well, actually, because obviously a lot of
Thank
things that are written with the sort of Western eye on shamanism can be quite, um, yeah, a little bit sort of, how can I put it? Not an awful lot of substance. Whereas with you really managed to sort of pick out of it the things that you know were sort of real. Um, it wasn't sort of airy fairy that it's all wonderful. You put it across really well.
you. Yeah.
So it's a good read, really good read. So you're in the middle of another one, or you're just waiting for another period of time before you start?
I've got another one. I was on pilgrimage uh, in February and March, oh no, March and April, and yeah, I've got a whole book that came to me
Yeah.
then,
All right.
eh, uh, and well, the kind of feeling of it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
loose structure,
Yeah.
but the feeling of it. And so yeah, that's kind of in the background right now, but
Yeah.
it's over this period is I do a lot of teaching from April to October really, so it won't be until the winter, and then yeah, I've got to trick myself into sitting down and starting it. But I always thought there'd be three, and so this will be my kind of last one, and I think it will be more the wisdom. The last one I intentionally wanted to use more references, more of a kind of uh, use clinical trials references, scientific type approach, more an academic type approach. Although I'm not an academic, but this I think the third one will go back like the first one to be a bit more personal and poetic because that
Yes.
is my language. Definitely. I mean,
Yes.
I can do that kind of academic type thing, but it's definitely the personal poetic. So I'll be weaving, and the essence of it will be about ritual and how we've never really gotten rid of ritual. It's just it manifests in many different forms, which is a, a subject I explored in one chapter in the first book, and it's something I really want to expand upon. It's how whether it's through sport or theatre
Yeah.
or different and all the everyday rituals that we've, but it's just the intention has kind of gone away. We've kind of lost a bit of that intention with
Yeah.
them. Or if you look at something like the explosion in the late 80s of the rave scene, the New Age travelers, and that how culture is constantly giving birth to these ways of to itself. Really, culture is constantly giving birth to itself, but the difference is this disconnect from what we were just talking about, a tradition and intention, and that if we were a bit more, because the other thing is the spirituality can become such a cliquey, divorced thing from everyday people, and that's the difference when you, I mean, going to the communities reminds me of growing up on a quite a rough housing estate in the 70s, and yet in our culture, in the West culture, that it seems to be predominantly sort of middle class people writing about this stuff, and that brings its own middle class values, and it's very different to the indigenous people because they're poor people, and in sort of Britain, they're the people that would be like the traveller types,
Yeah.
and so they're looked down upon by the rest of the society, and so it, I think there's a need for to not romanticize this stuff, really not romanticize it, and b bring it back to a kind of, because if we're going to change society, and presumably that's what most people want on some level, it has to go into kind of more mainstream society. But then there's always the risk it becomes diluted as something to be sold back to the masses, like you were saying, something to be bought in terms of enlightenment. So I think for me, because what I grew up with has always had this very tribal aspect to it. Very going to Ellen Road, which is the Leeds ground who I support as a kid, and having that ecstatic feeling of when they scored, and the sense of togetherness. That is the kind of similar energy to a ceremony, and the ecstasy, the sense of connection, and also having something opposing the opposition. But it's translating that with much clearer intention, so it's not just about us, a game if you like, or a sport, that it's something that is it. The thing with ceremony, it needs to bring people together, and it needs to bring the community together, and
Mm.
that needs to have a language that isn't so exclusive as spiritual language becomes very exclusive. And also
Yeah.
the thing you were talking about, that hierarchy thing, experts etc, then tend to, it looks down on mainstream society, it judges mainstream society. It
Yeah.
says, oh, these are the ones that are asleep, or they're the ones who don't get it,
Yeah.
and that is a very defensive position, and I've got no time for that,
No.
because this is, if we want to kind of change things, you need to be connecting with everyday people, and I think obviously it's always probably going to be a subculture of some description, but that doesn't mean to say it can't influence. And I think that is happening through things like rewilding, and this people's greater connection with their ancestors, looking at ancestry.com etc, people's greater desire to be in nature, things like that. It doesn't matter what language it's coaxed in. So yeah, that's quite a long answer, but that's
No, I get
pretty
that.
much what the book, that's
I
the intention behind the book, to
yeah.
make it much more accessible to the, you, of course you've been in an altered state, of course you've been in a trance state.
Yeah.
At that festival, or that ceremony, or that sports ground, or that, or whatever, you were in that state of ecstasy, you were in that trance state, you felt connected to everyone. That that you've experienced this isn't something that is so esoteric. Of course you've experienced it, and it's
Yeah.
how that is then, but how can we translate that into something that is going to be tradition, or within a kind of wider concept of not just we're in it because we like getting off our heads, or we like doing that, having that kind of loss of responsibility, but actually something that is feeding the sacred, feeding the gods, and there's intention and offerings behind it.
Mm. But just one point there, talking about, certain parts of society looking at other parts of society and looking down upon them, type of thing, like travelers and all that sort of thing. The poor. Um,
Yeah.
if you think about pop music, the most creative days that we've had, think about the 60s and the 70s musically. A lot of those guys were Keith and Dave and whatever, right? They were working class people.
Exactly.
Now it's not like that. It's really not like that, because if you wanted to learn to play a musical instrument or even have a musical instrument now, somebody's got to have the money to buy it, and for the lessons if you're going to do that, and so on. But of course, if you go back in time, there were free music lessons, and there was also in the 70s a chance for a lot of artists to be on the dole and, live in squats and all the rest of it while they were developing. And you think about the British art music movement and how many of those lived like that before they made a name for themselves. And, well, I was going to say Thatcher, but, it's not just Thatcher, but you understand what I'm getting at. This sort of thing, as soon as you go, oh, we can't have that, kind of just people doing nothing. But in actual fact, we ended up with this extraordinary thing. And, I look at that and think, well, that is a spiritual undertaking. It's art,
Exactly.
And so I think, as you say, there may be ways of being able for people to re-engage with things in a way that they don't think it's spiritual. They're having those experiences because we do. We're going in and out of one trance state to another all the time. We can be in a listening trance, or we can be in a walking trance, or we can be, it's just a case of which trance state are you in, and I think that's the thing. If we can, maybe there's a way for people to realize that it's about, as you said before, intention to why you're doing something. That's that might be an interesting thing to see if we can get that to happen. But anyway, look, Jez, that was brilliant. We've been talking for about an hour, mate. We've been talking for an hour.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I told you I'd bang on, didn't I?
Well, so do I. That was excellent. Thank you very much, and thoroughly enjoyed that. And
real pleasure.
So I'll put stuff in the show notes. So if you, I can find a lot of your links, but if you send me some stuff, that'd be really cool. And I know you're doing some talks and things, and you've just done one, haven't you? Somewhere, Burgess Hill, somewhere, was it?
Yeah. I think I'm doing another one in Glastonbury next week or week after.
Centre of the Universe. Well, maybe not,
exactly.
But maybe people in Glastonbury think it is. But there we go.
Exactly.
That's good. So thanks ever so much, mate. It was really good. Hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed the chat. Lots of stuff on the show notes. You can get to the details about Jez's book, or books actually, and obviously lots of stuff on there about Patreon and Blues Camp and all the stuff that I do as well. So until next time, we'll see you then.